Hey there, brave souls. Tonight we embark on a journey through the most wretched, disgusting, and soul-crushing occupations that medieval Europe had to offer. A time when your job description was less about career advancement and more about surviving another day without contracting plague, losing a limb, or drowning in human filth. So before we dive into this cesspool of historical horror, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching your ancestors suffer for your entertainment. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what ungodly hour it is for you. Because misery loves company, especially international company. Now, dim those lights, maybe light a candle for atmosphere, and prepare yourself for 8 tales of medieval employment that will make your worst job seem like a vacation in paradise. We're going to explore occupations so vile, so dangerous, and so socially degrading that they make modern customer service look like nobility. From the blood-soaked floors of execution chambers to the bone-filled pits of plague-ravaged cities, we'll meet the unsung heroes who kept medieval society functioning while slowly dying from their chosen professions. Tonight's journey will take us through 8 distinct circles of medieval employment hell, each more horrifying than the last. We'll discover why some jobs paid well because literally nobody else would do them, why certain professions required you to work exclusively at night, and why medieval career counseling probably consisted of someone pointing at you and saying, well, somebody has to do it. These weren't just jobs, they were acts of desperation, necessity, and occasionally, bizarre forms of religious devotion. So settle in, perhaps put on some soft background music to mask the imaginary screams of medieval laborious, and let's begin our descent into the rank, fetid, and gloriously awful world of medieval employment. Trust me, by the end of tonight's chronicles, you'll never complain about your commute again. Let's say you're born into medieval England, and your career aspirations are, shall we say, flexible. You don't have the breeding to be a knight, the faith to be a monk, or the skill to be a craftsman. So you take what's available, which in your case means becoming an executioner's assistant. Congratulations, you've just signed up to be death's most reliable employee, with a workplace that smells like iron, fear, and regret. Now, being an executioner's assistant wasn't just about swinging axes and looking menacing. Oh no, that would be too simple. You were responsible for the entire theatrical production of public execution. Your day started before dawn, preparing the scaffold, sharpening the tools, and making sure the chopping block was positioned just right for optimal crowd viewing. Because in medieval times, executions weren't just about justice, they were entertainment, and you were part stage manager, part cleanup crew, and part psychological scarring specialist. The tools of your trade were varied and horrifying. There was the trusty axe, of course, but also swords, ropes for hanging, and various implements of torture that would make modern horror movie directors weep with envy. You maintained these instruments with the care of a master craftsman, because a dull blade meant a messy execution, and a messy execution meant an angry crowd, and an angry crowd meant you might be joining your victims sooner than planned. Your typical execution day began with hauling the prisoner from their cell, often carrying them if they'd lost the ability to walk from fear or previous torture sessions. You'd escort them through jeering crowds, up onto the scaffold, and into position. Then came the moment of truth, where you'd assist the executioner in whatever grisly method had been prescribed by the court. Beheading, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Each method required different preparations and different levels of your involvement. The psychological toll was immense. You watched people die for a living, heard their final words, saw the light leave their eyes, and then cleaned up the mess afterward. Some assistants went mad, others became eerily comfortable with death, and a few found religion in the strangest places. There's something about watching a person's head roll into a basket that really makes you contemplate your life choices. But perhaps the worst part wasn't the executions themselves. It was everything that came after. You see, you didn't just kill people and go home for supper. You had to dispose of the bodies, clean the blood from the scaffold, and store the various body parts for display around the city. Heads went on spikes, limbs were hung from giblets, and torsos were buried in unmarked graves. You were essentially running a medieval body parts distribution center. The social stigma was crushing. People feared you, avoided you, and generally treated you like you carried the plague, which, given your working conditions, you might have. Children crossed the street when they saw you coming, Tavern keepers served you reluctantly, and even prostitutes had standards. You lived in a world where everyone knew what you did for a living, and everyone wished you didn't exist, even though they all came to watch you work. Payment was actually decent, because unsurprisingly, there wasn't a lot of competition for the position. You earned a regular wage from the crown, plus whatever you could scavenge from the executed criminals' belongings. Some assistants became wealthy men, though wealth means little when you can't buy respect, friendship, or a good night's sleep without nightmares. The working conditions were deplorable. You worked outdoors in all weather, ankle-deep in blood and mud, surrounded by screaming crowds and dying people. In winter, blood froze to the scaffold and had to be chipped off with hammers. In summer, the smell attracted flies, rats, and various other creatures that feasted on the leftovers of your profession. Your workplace was basically an open-air slaughterhouse with a viewing gallery. Health hazards were everywhere. You risked infection from blood-borne diseases, injury from struggling prisoners, and violence from angry crowds when executions went wrong. And they did go wrong, frequently. Ropes snapped, axes got stuck in bones, and sometimes prisoners survived their executions and had to be finished off with whatever was handy. These moments of professional failure were not well received by the paying customers. Yet despite all the horror, there was a strange sense of purpose to the work. You were enforcing the king's justice, maintaining social order, and providing closure for victims' families. You were also the last human face many condemned souls would see, which gave you a unique and terrible responsibility. Some assistants took this seriously, offering comfort or final prayers. Others just counted the coins and went home. The career path was limited but clear. You started as an assistant, maybe worked your way up to chief assistant, and if you were truly dedicated to the craft, you might eventually become the executioner yourself. It wasn't much of a ladder, but it was steady work in uncertain times. Some families made it a hereditary profession, passing down techniques, tools, and psychological trauma from father to son like a twisted family business. But here's where our tale takes an interesting turn, because being an executioner's assistant taught you things about death, about people, and about the thin line between order and chaos. Knowledge that would prove useful in our next occupation, because in medieval times, death was just the beginning of your professional relationship with the deceased. So you've grown tired of watching people die for entertainment and profit. You want something more spiritual, more meaningful, something that connects you to the divine. Well, congratulations on your career transition to Sin Eater, because nothing says religious devotion quite like consuming the spiritual filth of dying strangers while their families watch in horrified fascination. The Sin Eater was perhaps the most psychologically twisted profession in medieval society, and that's saying something considering we just discussed professional executioners. Your job was simple in concept, devastating in practice. When someone lay dying, especially someone who had lived a particularly wicked life, their family would summon you to perform a ritual that would cleanse the dying person's soul and transfer their sins to you. Yes, you literally ate their sins, along with their guilt, their shame, and their eternal damnation. The ritual itself was theatrical and deeply unsettling. You would arrive at the deathbed, often in the middle of the night, carrying a loaf of bread and a cup of wine or ale. The dying person would confess their sins while touching the bread, transferring their spiritual corruption into the food. Then you would eat the bread and drink the wine, symbolically consuming their sins and taking on their punishment in the afterlife. The family paid you a few coins, the sinner died with a clean soul, and you walked away carrying their ticket to hell. But the bread wasn't just bread. Oh no. Families often brought you meals that had been prepared with ingredients symbolic of the deceased's particular sins. A glutton's sins might come with rich meats and sweet cakes. A greedy merchant's sins arrived with expensive wines and exotic spices. An adulterer's spiritual corruption was served with foods considered aphrodisiacs. You weren't just eating sins, you were dining on personalized platters of human failure. The psychological burden was indescribable. Every meal you consumed carried with it the weight of someone else's moral failures. You went to bed each night knowing that your soul was a dumping ground for the spiritual refuse of your community. Some Sin Eaters kept detailed records of whose sins they'd consumed, creating libraries of human wickedness that would make confession booths seem like children's bedtime stories. Socially, You existed in a space beyond normal human interaction. People needed you desperately but couldn't bear to be around you. You were simultaneously the most important person at a deathbed and the most reviled person in the community. Families would summon you in secret, pay you quickly, and then pretend they'd never seen you before. You were a walking reminder of everyone's mortality and moral failings. The working conditions varied wildly depending on your client's social status. Wealthy families might summon you to ornate bedchambers with silk curtains and silver plates. Poor families called you to one-room hovels where you'd perform the ritual surrounded by children, animals, and the general chaos of medieval poverty. But regardless of the setting, you were always eating someone's spiritual corruption while their relatives watched you damn yourself for their loved one's salvation. Payment was irregular and often inadequate, considering you were literally selling your soul by installments. Rich families might pay well for particularly dramatic sin-eating ceremonies, especially if the deceased had been notably wicked. Poor families offered whatever they could, sometimes just the meal itself and a desperate blessing. Some sin-eaters accumulated significant wealth, though it came at the cost of their eternal salvation, which seemed like a questionable investment strategy. The health risks went beyond the spiritual. You were eating food prepared by grieving, often desperate people who weren't always careful about hygiene or food safety. You consumed meals that had been sitting next to dying people, handled by unwashed hands, and prepared with ingredients of questionable quality. Food poisoning was a constant threat, though it probably seemed minor compared to eternal damnation. Some sin-eaters developed elaborate personal rituals to cope with their profession. They might fast for days before consuming particularly heavy loads of sin, believing that purification would somehow balance the spiritual books. Others developed drinking problems, figuring that if they were going to hell anyway, they might as well enjoy the journey. A few became religious zealots, convinced that their suffering was somehow part of God's greater plan. The variety of sins you encountered was exhausting. Pride, wrath, envy, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust were just the basics. You also consumed more specific transgressions. The sins of merchants who cheated their customers, priests who broke their vows, wives who poisoned their husbands, and children who dishonored their parents. Each sin came with its own flavor of corruption, its own weight of guilt, and its own contribution to your growing collection of spiritual baggage. Career advancement was impossible because there was nowhere to go. You couldn't retire from being a sin-eater because the sins you'd consumed were permanent spiritual fixtures. You couldn't train apprentices because no sane person would voluntarily choose such a profession. You just continued eating sins until you died, at which point your own funeral became a theological nightmare because no priest wanted to perform services for someone whose soul was a warehouse of other people's moral failures. Yet there was a strange honor in the work, a sense that you were performing one of humanity's most necessary services. You were the spiritual janitor of your community, cleaning up moral messes so that others could face death with clean consciences. Families might despise you, but they also depended on you, and that dependency gave you a peculiar form of power. But consuming the sins of the living was just the beginning of your relationship with mortality, because in medieval times, death was a complex business that required specialized services. And speaking of specialized services, our next profession dealt with the physical aftermath of death in ways that would make sin-eating seem almost pleasant by comparison. You've graduated from eating sins to washing corpses, which honestly feels like a lateral career move in the medieval employment market. As a corpse washer, you've entered the glamorous world of post-mortem hygiene, where your clients never complain about your technique but also never tip for exceptional service. Your job is to prepare the recently deceased for their final public appearance, ensuring they look presentable for relatives who last saw them screaming in agony from plague, violence, or medical treatment. The corpse washing process was surprisingly complex and varied dramatically depending on your client's social status and cause of death. A wealthy merchant who died peacefully in his sleep required different treatment than a peasant who'd been trampled by horses or a plague victim whose body had been rotting in the street for days. You were part mortician, part detective, and part artist, trying to reconstruct human dignity from whatever biological disaster had been delivered to your workspace. Your workshop was typically located far from residential areas, because the smell of death mixed with soap and herbs created an aroma that could clear entire neighborhoods. You worked with buckets of water that had to be heated over fires, creating clouds of steam that carried the scent of decomposition throughout your building. The combination of heat, moisture, and decaying flesh created a working environment that was essentially a sauna built in hell. The tools of your trade were deceptively simple but absolutely essential. You had various brushes for scrubbing skin and hair, cloths for wiping away bodily fluids, knives for removing clothing that had become fused to skin, and an assortment of herbs and oils for masking the smell of death. You also kept a supply of wax, paint, and other cosmetic materials for reconstructing faces that had been damaged by disease or violence. Each corpse presented unique challenges that tested your professional skills and personal fortitude. Plague victims arrived with blackened extremities and swollen lymph nodes that had to be carefully cleaned without bursting and spreading infection. Violence victims came with wounds that had to be sewn shut and injuries that had to be concealed with careful positioning and strategic cloth placement. The elderly arrived with bodies that had begun decomposing before death, requiring extensive cleaning and cosmetic reconstruction. The washing process itself was intimate and disturbing in ways that few other professions could match. You handled naked corpses, manipulating their limbs, cleaning their private areas, and examining every inch of their bodies for damage that needed to be addressed. You became familiar with the human body in its most vulnerable and degraded state, learning things about mortality that most people never experienced until their own deaths. Seasonal variations made your job even more challenging. Summer corpses arrived bloated and crawling with insects, requiring immediate attention before decomposition made them unwashable. Winter corpses were often frozen solid, needing to be thawed carefully to avoid damaging the skin. Spring brought bodies that had been preserved by cold weather but were beginning to thaw and rot, creating timing challenges that tested your efficiency. The emotional toll was significant because you often knew the people you were washing. In small medieval communities, you might find yourself preparing your neighbor's child, your baker's wife, or your priest's mother. You saw these people's bodies in their most degraded state, learned their most intimate secrets through physical examination, and then had to face their families afterward while pretending you hadn't seen their loved one's corpse infested with maggots. Payment varied wildly depending on your client's circumstances and your service's complexity. Wealthy families paid well for elaborate preparation that included cosmetic reconstruction, expensive oils, and silk wrappings. Poor families offered whatever they could, sometimes just food or clothing, for basic washing services. Some corpse washers developed sliding fee scales, charging more for particularly challenging bodies or rush jobs when families needed quick turnarounds for burial scheduling. The health risks were enormous and constantly present. You worked with bodies that had died from infectious diseases, handling fluids and tissues that could transmit plague, leprosy, and various other medieval medical disasters. You breathed air filled with particles of decomposing flesh, absorbed unknown pathogens through cuts in your hands, and lived in constant fear that your next client might be carrying the disease that would kill you. Professional relationships with other death-related occupations were complex and sometimes competitive. You worked closely with grave diggers, who appreciated bodies that had been properly prepared for burial. You competed with family members who sometimes insisted on washing their own relatives, depriving you of income. You collaborated with priests who needed bodies presented in specific ways for religious ceremonies. Some corpse washers developed specialized techniques that distinguished them from their competitors. You might become known for your skill with violence victims, your ability to restore plague-damaged faces, or your expertise in preparing bodies for long-distance transport to family burial sites. These specializations could increase your income but also meant you attracted the most challenging and disturbing cases. The psychological coping mechanisms varied among practitioners. Some corpse washers became deeply religious, viewing their work as a form of spiritual service to the dead and bereaved. Others developed dark senses of humor, joking about their clients' conditions and circumstances. A few became obsessed with death, studying decomposition patterns and developing theories about the afterlife based on their observations. Working hours were unpredictable because death doesn't operate on a schedule. You might work for days during plague outbreaks, processing dozens of bodies in assembly line fashion. During peaceful periods, you might go weeks without work, wondering if you should have chosen a more reliable profession. The feast or famine nature of the business made financial planning nearly impossible. But your expertise in preparing the dead for burial was just one part of a larger medieval death industry that employed thousands of people in various capacities. And speaking of death-related employment opportunities, our next profession took a different approach to dealing with mortality's physical aftermath, one that involved collecting rather than cleaning the evidence of life's ultimate conclusion. Perhaps washing corpses felt too immediate, too personal, too involved with the messy wetness of recent death. Maybe you prefer your mortality dried, aged, and conveniently skeletal. Well, congratulations on your career transition to bone collector, a profession that proves medieval people found ways to monetize absolutely every aspect of the human experience, including the calcified remains of that experience. As a bone collector, you dealt with death's leftovers after nature and time had done most of the unpleasant work for you. Your job involved harvesting human bones from various sources: old battlefields, abandoned plague pits, overcrowded cemeteries, and anywhere else that medieval society had deposited bodies and then conveniently forgotten about them. You were essentially mining the dead, extracting valuable materials from humanity's discarded packaging. The demand for human bones was surprisingly robust in medieval times, driven by multiple industries that modern people would find deeply disturbing. Physicians and barber surgeons wanted bones for medical study and surgical practice. Artists needed them for proportional references when creating religious artwork. Alchemists used ground bones in various mystical preparations. Even farmers occasionally purchased bone meal for fertilizing crops, though they preferred not to know the specific origin of their soil supplements. Your typical workday began before dawn, because bone collecting was generally frowned upon by local authorities and definitely not appreciated by grieving families who might recognize their relatives' remains in your collection bags. You traveled with a cart, various digging tools, and containers for sorting different types of bones. The work was physically demanding, requiring hours of excavation in locations that were often unstable, poorly drained, and inhabited by creatures that had developed a taste for decaying flesh. Battlefield harvesting was perhaps your most lucrative but dangerous specialty. Old battle sites were gold mines of skeletal material, but they were also often cursed, haunted, or claimed by local lords who didn't appreciate people digging up their property. You had to work quickly and quietly, identifying the choicest specimens while avoiding detection by guards, ghosts, or other bone collectors who might view your presence as territorial encroachment. The quality control aspects of your profession required surprising expertise. Not all bones were created equal in the medieval market. Fresh bones from young, healthy individuals commanded premium prices from medical practitioners. Ancient bones from holy sites were valuable to religious institutions for relic production. Bones from executed criminals were prized by witches and folk healers for various supernatural applications. You learned to identify valuable specimens by age, condition, and presumed origin. Plague pit excavation was your most dangerous but profitable work. These mass graves contained hundreds of bodies that had been hastily buried during epidemic outbreaks, creating concentrated bone deposits that could supply your inventory for months. However, plague pits were often still infectious years after burial, and disturbing them could release diseases that had been dormant in the soil. You risked contracting plague, typhus, or various other medieval medical disasters while searching for valuable specimens. The sorting and processing phase of your work required careful attention to anatomical detail. Different bones served different purposes in your various markets. Skulls were valuable to physicians for brain study and to artists for skull measurements. Long bones were prized for surgical practice and mathematical calculations. Small bones like fingers and toes were perfect for detailed anatomical study. You became an expert in human skeletal anatomy, though your knowledge came from handling thousands of individual specimens rather than formal medical training. Transportation presented unique logistical challenges. Bones were bulky, heavy, and difficult to conceal when you needed to move them discreetly. You developed techniques for efficient packing, strategic route planning, and creative explanations for why your cart rattled with suspicious clicking sounds. Some bone collectors posed as legitimate merchants selling other goods, using bones as hidden cargo that provided their real profit margins. Customer relationships required diplomatic skills that weren't typically associated with grave robbing. Physicians wanted specific types of bones for particular studies, requiring you to fulfill custom orders that might take months to complete. Artists needed perfect specimens without damage or disease markers. Alchemists had bizarre requirements based on astrological theories and mystical beliefs that made little sense but paid well enough to justify the effort. The seasonal nature of your work created feast or famine economic cycles. Spring brought opportunities to excavate sites that had been frozen during winter, but it also brought increased activity from authorities who could more easily track your movements. Summer provided ideal working conditions but attracted competition from other bone collectors. Autumn was harvest season for recently dead plague victims. Winter forced indoor work, processing and preparing bones you'd collected during busier seasons. Legal complications were constant and varied by location. Some regions explicitly banned bone collecting, making your entire profession illegal. Others required licenses or permitted bone collection only from designated areas. A few places actually encouraged the practice as a public health measure, viewing bone collectors as cleanup crews who removed unsanitary reminders of mortality from populated areas. Professional hazards extended beyond legal troubles to include supernatural concerns that were taken seriously in medieval times. Many people believed that disturbing graves would curse the disturber, attract vengeful spirits, or provoke divine punishment. You had to weigh these spiritual risks against economic benefits while developing personal rituals and protections that might safeguard your soul while you harvested other people's earthly remains. The psychological impact of handling thousands of human bones created mental health challenges that medieval society wasn't equipped to address. Some bone collectors became obsessed with death, developing elaborate theories about mortality and the afterlife based on their extensive experience with skeletal remains. Others became desensitized to human suffering, viewing people as future inventory rather than living beings. A few found peace in their work, believing they were providing valuable services that advanced medical knowledge and artistic achievement. But your expertise in harvesting the dead was just one aspect of medieval society's complex relationship with mortality and human remains. The bones you collected often ended up in places where living people were forced to confront death in much more immediate and personal ways. Places where our next professions spent their entire careers surrounded by humanity's greatest fears and darkest impulses. You've grown weary of dealing with the already dead and their leftover bones. Perhaps you crave more interaction with the living, more dynamic workplace relationships, more opportunities for creative problem solving. Well, congratulations on your career advancement to Dungeon Keeper, where you'll finally get to work with people who are still breathing, at least initially, and who will provide you with endless entertainment through their screams, pleas, and gradual descent into madness. As a dungeon keeper, you managed what was essentially an underground hotel for people who would never be checking out. Your establishment was located beneath castles, prisons, or purpose-built facilities designed to house individuals who had fallen out of favor with local authorities. Your guests included political prisoners, accused witches, debtors, heretics, and various other people whose crimes ranged from genuine wrongdoing to simply annoying someone with more power than sense. The dungeon itself was your workplace, your home, and your kingdom. These subterranean facilities were marvels of medieval engineering designed to maximize human suffering while minimizing maintenance costs. Stone walls wept with moisture, creating an atmosphere that was perpetually damp and cold. Narrow windows, when they existed at all, provided just enough light to remind prisoners that a world existed beyond their reach. The floors were typically dirt or rough stone, perfect for absorbing bodily fluids and maintaining sanitary conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Your daily routine began before dawn with a tour of your domain, checking on your guests' conditions and determining who had survived the night. Medieval dungeons had surprisingly high mortality rates, not from deliberate execution but from disease, malnutrition, exposure, and the general stress of being imprisoned in conditions that made animal stables seem comfortable. Dead prisoners created paperwork problems and potential health hazards, so early identification of casualties was essential for efficient facility management. Feeding your prisoners was both a logistical challenge and a form of psychological warfare. Most dungeons operated on starvation budgets that provided barely enough nutrition to keep prisoners alive but insufficient food to maintain health or hope. You distributed meals of watery gruel, moldy bread, and occasionally scraps from the Lord's table if you were feeling generous or had been specifically instructed to keep certain prisoners in reasonable condition for future interrogation or execution. The variety of prisoners in your care created complex management challenges that required diplomatic skills, physical strength, and psychological resilience. Political prisoners often arrived with entourages of supporters who attempted to bribe you for better treatment, creating opportunities for supplemental income but also risks if you were caught accepting unauthorized payments. Religious heretics frequently arrived with unshakable faith that made them either inspiring or infuriating depending on your personal beliefs and professional patience. Torture was often part of your job description, though the extent of your involvement varied depending on local customs and your personal aptitude for inflicting pain. Some dungeon keepers were expected to operate torture devices, conduct interrogations, and extract confessions through physical persuasion. Others simply maintained the equipment and provided technical support for visiting specialists who handled the more creative aspects of prisoner motivation. Either way, you worked in an environment where human screaming was background noise and bloodstains were interior decoration. The tools of your trade included keys, chains, shackles, and various restraint devices designed to prevent escape while maximizing discomfort. You maintained torture equipment that ranged from simple devices like thumbscrews and iron boots to elaborate contraptions like racks, breaking wheels, and iron maidens. Each device required regular maintenance, calibration, and cleaning, making you part jailer, part mechanic, and part sanitation worker. Prisoner escape attempts provided excitement and variety to your otherwise routine work schedule. Medieval dungeons weren't as secure as modern prisons, relying more on remoteness and harsh punishment than sophisticated security systems. Prisoners regularly attempted to dig through walls, pick locks, overpower guards, or simply walk out during shift changes. Successful escapes reflected poorly on your professional competence and often resulted in punishment that made you temporarily sympathetic to your prisoners' perspectives. The social isolation of dungeon work was profound and psychologically damaging. You lived underground, surrounded by suffering people who viewed you as their tormentor regardless of your personal feelings about their situations. Your co-workers were typically guards, torturers, and other individuals whose professions didn't exactly make for stimulating dinner conversation. You rarely saw sunlight, breathed fresh air, or interacted with people who weren't either imprisoning or imprisoned. Health hazards in dungeon work were numerous and constantly present. You worked in environments with poor ventilation, contaminated water, and diseased prisoners who could transmit various medieval medical disasters through casual contact. The dampness caused respiratory problems, joint pain, and skin conditions that medieval medicine couldn't effectively treat. You also risked injury from violent prisoners, accidents with torture equipment, and occupational hazards like falling stones from deteriorating dungeon ceilings. Payment for dungeon work varied dramatically depending on your employer's wealth and the importance of your prisoners. Royal dungeons might pay decent wages and provide comfortable living quarters, while local lords' dungeons offered subsistence wages and accommodations that weren't much better than the prisoner cells. Some dungeon keepers augmented their income through prisoner bribes, selling information to families, or providing unauthorized services like smuggling messages or contraband items. The psychological profile required for successful dungeon keeping was complex and often contradictory. You needed enough empathy to understand human behavior, but not so much that you'd be paralyzed by your prisoner's suffering. You required physical courage to handle violent criminals, but also diplomatic skills to manage political prisoners who might eventually regain power and remember how they were treated. You had to be loyal enough to resist bribes, but flexible enough to interpret orders in ways that allowed for practical facility management. Prisoner relationships developed over time and created emotional complications that weren't covered in your job training. Long-term prisoners became familiar faces whose stories, families, and personal struggles you learned through daily interaction. Some dungeon keepers developed genuine friendships with prisoners, creating ethical conflicts when orders came to execute or torture people they'd grown to respect. Others maintained professional distance by viewing prisoners as livestock rather than humans, a psychological adaptation that had its own mental health consequences. The career path for dungeon keepers was limited but sometimes offered advancement opportunities within the medieval justice system. Experienced keepers might be promoted to head guard positions, torture specialist roles, or administrative positions managing multiple facilities. Some retired to less stressful occupations like farming or crafts, though their professional experience often made them poor fits for jobs requiring trust, optimism, or belief in human goodness. But your expertise in managing captive humans in controlled environments prepared you for other medieval occupations that required similar skills in different settings. And as we'll discover in our next profession, medieval employment opportunities sometimes took those same management skills and applied them to challenges that were somehow even more psychologically demanding than running underground prisons. Perhaps the constant human interaction of dungeon keeping has worn down your social batteries. Maybe you're seeking fresh air, open spaces, and work that doesn't involve listening to people scream or beg for mercy. Well, congratulations on your career transition to human scarecrow, a profession that offers unlimited outdoor time, flexible working hours, and absolutely no meaningful human contact whatsoever. You've traded the screams of prisoners for the cawing of crows, which might seem like an improvement until you realize that at least prisoners occasionally stopped making noise when they died. The human scarecrow profession emerged from the simple economic reality that cloth and straw scarecrows weren't particularly effective at protecting crops from bird damage. Farmers discovered that birds quickly learned to ignore stationary deterrents, but they remained genuinely afraid of actual humans moving around in their fields. The solution was obvious. Hire someone to stand in fields all day, every day, scaring away birds through their mere presence and occasional aggressive gesturing. Your workplace was whatever field currently needed protection, which meant you were essentially a nomadic agricultural worker who moved from farm to farm following the growing seasons. Spring meant protecting newly planted seeds from hungry birds who viewed freshly tilled fields as elaborate buffet. Summer involved guarding growing crops from various flying pests who had developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding traditional scarecrows. Autumn brought the most intensive work period, as birds of all species converged on ripening grain fields like feathered locust swarms. The job requirements were deceptively simple but surprisingly demanding. You needed to remain visible and active in fields from dawn to dusk, moving constantly to maintain the illusion that human presence was persistent and threatening. You couldn't sit down for extended periods, leave your post for breaks, or show any signs of routine behavior that intelligent birds might recognize as patterns. You were essentially performing an 8-hour theatrical production for an audience of birds who were actively trying to outwit your performance. Your tools were basic but essential for effective crop protection. You carried noisemakers like bells, rattles, or pieces of metal that could be clanged together to create sounds that frightened birds. You had various projectiles for throwing at particularly bold or persistent avian thieves, though accuracy was less important than creating the impression of active human aggression. Some human scarecrows developed specialized equipment like slings or blowguns for targeting specific problem birds who seemed to be leading organized raids on protected crops. The psychological challenges of human scarecrow work were profound and largely unrecognized by employers who viewed the job as simple manual labor. You spent entire days alone in fields with no human interaction, no mental stimulation, and no entertainment beyond watching birds attempt various strategies for circumventing your presence. The isolation was absolute and crushing, particularly for people who had previously worked in social environments where human contact was available even if it wasn't always pleasant. Weather conditions made your outdoor office alternately unbearable and dangerous depending on the season and local climate. Summer heat could cause dehydration, heat stroke, and sunburn that made you look like a scarecrow yourself. Spring and autumn rains soaked you to the skin and created muddy field conditions that made movement difficult and exhausting. Winter work, when it was available, involved standing in frozen fields while wearing whatever inadequate clothing you could afford on scarecrow wages. The effectiveness of your work depended largely on your creativity and adaptability, since birds were surprisingly intelligent opponents who quickly learned to recognize and counter your deterrent strategies. You had to vary your movement patterns, change your noise-making schedules, and develop new intimidation techniques to stay ahead of avian adaptation. Some human scarecrows became genuine experts in bird behavior, developing sophisticated understanding of different species' feeding patterns, social structures, and psychological vulnerabilities. Compensation for human scarecrow work was typically minimal and often paid in kind rather than actual money. Farmers might provide meals, temporary shelter, or small portions of the crops you were protecting, but actual wages were rare and inadequate. The economics of crop protection rarely justified significant labor costs, particularly for a job that anyone could theoretically perform regardless of skill, education, or previous experience. Professional hazards included exposure to agricultural chemicals, insect bites, plant allergies, and various wildlife encounters that went beyond simple bird management. Fields were ecosystems that included snakes, rodents, larger predators, and insects that viewed human scarecrows as either threats to be attacked or convenient sources of blood to be harvested. You also risked injury from agricultural equipment, accidents in uneven terrain, and conflicts with property owners who might mistake you for trespassers or crop thieves. The social stigma attached to human scarecrow work was particularly harsh because the profession was viewed as suitable only for people who couldn't find any other employment. You were often mentally ill individuals, elderly people who couldn't perform physical labor, or social outcasts who weren't welcome in communities. The job attracted people who were already marginalized, and the isolation of the work further separated them from normal social interaction and community support systems. Some human scarecrows developed elaborate personal rituals and mental exercises to cope with the psychological demands of prolonged isolation. You might create imaginary conversations with birds, invent games involving crop protection, or develop philosophical theories about the relationship between humans and nature. These coping mechanisms were essential for maintaining sanity, but also contributed to the perception that human scarecrows were eccentric or mentally unstable. The seasonal nature of agricultural work created economic instability that made financial planning impossible. You might work intensively during growing seasons but face unemployment during winter months when crops didn't need protection. This boom-bust cycle forced human scarecrows to find alternative employment during off-seasons, often in jobs that were equally marginal and poorly paid. Career advancement opportunities were essentially non-existent since human scarecrow work was viewed as temporary employment for people between other jobs rather than a legitimate profession with development potential. Some experienced scarecrows might be promoted to supervising multiple fields or training new workers, but these advancement opportunities were rare and didn't significantly improve wages or working conditions. But your expertise in agricultural protection and your intimate familiarity with rural working conditions prepared you for understanding other medieval occupations that combined outdoor work with specialized knowledge. And as we'll discover in our next profession, medieval employment sometimes required workers to apply protective skills in contexts that were far more dangerous and socially significant than simple crop protection. You've finally grown tired of scaring birds and standing alone in fields, contemplating the futility of agricultural protection and your place in the grand scheme of medieval employment. Perhaps you're ready for more meaningful work, something that serves humanity's greater needs, something that puts you on the front lines of medieval medicine's brave battle against disease and death. Well, congratulations on your career transition to plague doctor's apprentice, where you'll discover that medieval medicine's relationship with disease was less brave battle and more elaborate costume party with a mortality rate that would horrify modern statisticians. As a plague doctor's apprentice, you worked alongside one of medieval medicine's most theatrical and arguably least effective practitioners. Plague doctors were physicians who specialized in treating bubonic plague victims during epidemic outbreaks, though treating might be an overly generous description of their actual medical interventions. Your master wore the iconic bird-like mask filled with aromatic herbs, believed to protect against bad air that supposedly caused plague, while you assisted with treatments that ranged from bloodletting and prayer to elaborate rituals involving astronomical calculations and herbal preparations that had no relationship to actual disease management. Your daily routine began before dawn with preparation of your master's protective equipment and medical supplies. The famous plague doctor costume required careful assembly, with each component serving specific theoretical purposes based on medieval medical theory. The leather beak was packed with herbs and spices believed to purify infected air. The long coat was treated with wax or oil to prevent plague transmission through fabric. The glass eyepieces were positioned to avoid direct eye contact with infected patients. Your job involved maintaining this elaborate costume while also preparing your own inferior protective gear, which typically consisted of whatever cloth and herbs you could afford on apprentice wages. The medical theory underlying plague treatment was a fascinating combination of classical learning, religious belief, and complete ignorance about actual disease transmission. Your master operated under the assumption that plague was caused by corrupted air, imbalanced bodily humors, divine punishment for sin, or astrological influences that could be counteracted through appropriate medical interventions. You learned to prepare treatments based on these theories, creating elaborate mixtures of herbs, minerals, and bodily fluids that had absolutely no therapeutic value but provided comfort to families who needed to believe that something was being done for their dying relatives. Patient visits were theatrical productions that combined medical examination, religious ceremony, and social ritual in ways that served everyone's psychological needs while doing nothing to address the actual medical emergency. You accompanied your master to homes, hospitals, and makeshift treatment centers where plague victims lay dying in conditions that would challenge modern infection control protocols. Your role involved carrying medical supplies, restraining delirious patients, recording symptoms and treatments, and providing physical labor that allowed your master to maintain professional dignity while dealing with the messier aspects of plague medicine. The treatments you assisted with were varied, creative, and uniformly ineffective against actual bubonic plague. Bloodletting was performed to balance humors and remove corrupted blood, which primarily served to weaken patients who were already dying from systemic infection. Herbal preparations were applied to plague buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that gave the disease its name, in attempts to draw out poison or encourage drainage. You prepared poultices, tinctures, and salves from recipes that had been passed down through generations of physicians who had never successfully cured a single plague patient. The psychological aspects of plague medicine were perhaps more important than the physical treatments, since families needed to believe that professional help was available even when that help was medically worthless. Your master provided hope, comfort, and social ritual around the process of dying, serving as a bridge between the medical and religious communities that both claimed authority over plague treatment. You learned to comfort grieving families, explain treatment failures in ways that maintained your master's reputation, and perform the social functions that made plague medicine valuable even when it wasn't medically effective. The occupational hazards of plague medicine were obvious and constantly present. You worked in close contact with highly infectious patients, handled contaminated materials, and breathed air in enclosed spaces where plague transmission was essentially guaranteed. Medieval protective equipment provided psychological comfort but no actual protection against airborne or flea-borne plague transmission. Most plague doctors and their apprentices eventually contracted the disease they were supposedly treating, creating high turnover rates that made apprenticeship training a constantly ongoing process. The financial aspects of plague medicine were complex and often problematic. Wealthy families paid substantial fees for plague doctor services, viewing the expense as necessary for maintaining hope and fulfilling social obligations to dying relatives. Poor families often couldn't afford professional medical care, relying instead on folk remedies, religious intervention, or simply waiting for death. This economic disparity created ethical dilemmas about medical access while also providing income opportunities for practitioners willing to work during epidemic outbreaks when other physicians fled to safer locations. The social status of plague medicine practitioners was contradictory and unstable. During epidemic outbreaks, plague doctors were viewed as heroic figures who risked their lives to serve suffering communities. Between outbreaks, they were often viewed with suspicion and fear, associated with death and disease in ways that made normal social interaction difficult. You experienced this social isolation firsthand, finding that your professional association with plague medicine made you unwelcome in many social situations even when you weren't actively treating infectious patients. The learning process for plague medicine involved mastering medical theory that was fundamentally incorrect, treatment protocols that were therapeutically useless, and social skills that were essential for maintaining professional credibility despite consistent treatment failures. You studied classical medical texts, learned to identify various disease symptoms, and practiced treatments that had been unsuccessful for centuries but remained standard medical practice because no effective alternatives were available. The emotional toll of plague medicine was devastating and largely unacknowledged by medieval medical education. You watched hundreds of patients die despite your best efforts, saw families destroyed by disease, and lived with the constant knowledge that your medical interventions were essentially elaborate placebos that provided comfort but no actual healing. Some plague medicine practitioners became deeply religious, viewing their work as spiritual service rather than medical treatment. Others became cynical about medicine's limitations, though they continued practicing because alternative employment was often unavailable or economically inferior. The seasonal nature of plague outbreaks created irregular work patterns that made career planning difficult. Major plague epidemics might provide years of intensive, well-paid work followed by long periods of unemployment when disease transmission slowed or stopped. You learned to save money during epidemic outbreaks and find alternative employment during quiet periods, though your association with plague medicine often limited other employment opportunities. But your intimate experience with medieval medicine's limitations and your first-hand knowledge of how diseases spread through communities gave you unique insights into the complex relationship between individual suffering and social systems. And as our final tale will reveal, some medieval professions combined medical knowledge with other skills in ways that created opportunities for both service and personal advancement. Though these opportunities came with their own unique risks and moral complications that would test everything you'd learned about survival in medieval society's most challenging occupations. So here we are, at the end of our journey through medieval society's most gruesome employment opportunities. You've survived 8 different careers that would make modern workplace safety inspectors weep blood and file complaints with supernatural authorities. You've executed criminals, consumed sins, washed corpses, collected bones, managed dungeons, scared birds, and assisted with plague treatments that killed more patients than they cured. But there's one final profession we haven't discussed, one that combined elements from all the others in ways that created the most powerful and dangerous career path available in medieval society. You see, throughout your various occupations, you've been learning things that most people never discovered about death, disease, human nature, and the hidden mechanisms that kept medieval society functioning. You understood how legal systems actually worked from your time assisting executioners. You learned about spiritual corruption and redemption from eating sins. You discovered anatomical secrets from washing corpses and collecting bones. You mastered psychological manipulation from managing prisoners. You developed survival skills from agricultural work and medical experience from plague treatments. This combination of knowledge, experience, and social marginalization created opportunities for entering medieval society's most secretive and influential profession, the professional poisoner. Not the crude murderer for hire that popular fiction portrays, but a sophisticated practitioner who combined medical knowledge, chemical expertise, psychological insight, and social access to provide specialized services for clients who needed discrete solutions to political, personal, and financial problems. Professional poisoning required exactly the skills you developed through your various medieval employment experiences. Your knowledge of anatomy from corpse washing and bone collecting helped you understand how different poisons affected various body systems. Your experience with herbal preparations from plague medicine gave you chemical knowledge for creating undetectable toxins. Your understanding of human psychology from dungeon work and sin eating provided insights into victim behavior and client motivation. Your social invisibility from marginalized occupations gave you access to places and people that more respectable individuals couldn't reach. The clients for professional poisoning services were typically wealthy, powerful individuals who needed to eliminate obstacles to their ambitions without attracting legal attention or social scandal. Nobles who wanted to inherit property from inconvenient relatives, merchants who needed to eliminate business competitors, priests who sought advancement within church hierarchy, and political figures who required discreet removal of opponents. These clients paid extremely well for services that couldn't be obtained through legal means and carried enormous risks for practitioners. The techniques of professional poisoning were sophisticated and varied depending on the specific requirements of each assignment. Slow-acting poisons that mimicked natural diseases allowed victims to die gradually without arousing suspicion. Fast-acting toxins created dramatic but apparently natural deaths during social events where witnesses could testify to sudden illness. Contact poisons applied to clothing or personal items eliminated victims through skin absorption. Delayed action preparations could be administered days or weeks before taking effect, providing perfect alibis for clients who needed to be elsewhere when deaths occurred. The preparation of poisons required extensive knowledge of chemistry, botany, and human physiology that was far beyond what medieval medical education typically provided. You learned to extract toxins from various plants, animals, and minerals using techniques that had been developed and refined by generations of practitioners working in absolute secrecy. You studied the effects of different substances on various body systems, learned to calculate dosages based on victim characteristics, and mastered methods for concealing poisons in food, drink, cosmetics, and other everyday items that victims would use without suspicion. The business aspects of professional poisoning were complex and dangerous, requiring careful client screening, secure payment methods, and elaborate precautions to prevent exposure or betrayal. You developed networks of informants who provided intelligence about potential targets, suppliers who furnished rare ingredients without asking questions, and intermediaries who facilitated client contact without revealing identities. The economics were excellent but extremely risky, since discovery meant certain execution and payment disputes could be resolved through methods that were distinctly unfavorable to service providers. The psychological profile required for successful professional poisoning combined elements from all your previous occupations in ways that created a unique and disturbing professional identity. You needed the emotional detachment of an executioner, the spiritual flexibility of a sin eater, the anatomical knowledge of a corpse washer, the systematic thinking of a bone collector, the psychological insight of a dungeon keeper, the patience of a human scarecrow, and the medical expertise of a plague doctor's apprentice. This combination of skills and experiences created practitioners who were simultaneously valuable and terrifying to medieval society's power structure. But here's where our tale takes its most chilling turn, because the skills you developed through 8 different medieval occupations hadn't just prepared you for a career in professional poisoning. They'd prepared you for something far more significant and dangerous. Something that medieval authorities were just beginning to recognize as a threat to the entire social order. Something that would change the course of history in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries. You see, the combination of medical knowledge, chemical expertise, anatomical understanding, and social access that made you an effective poisoner also made you something else entirely. Something that medieval society had no name for and no defense against. Something that would emerge from the shadows of history's most gruesome occupations to challenge the very foundations of feudal power structures. The records from this period become mysteriously sparse at exactly this point, with entire archives disappearing and official documents showing signs of deliberate alteration. Church records mention practitioners of forbidden arts, who possessed knowledge that threatens God's divine order. Royal correspondence references specialists whose services are required but whose existence must not be acknowledged. Guild records show payments to individuals whose names have been systematically erased but whose compensation suggests work of extraordinary value and danger. What exactly these mysterious practitioners were doing, who they were working for, and how their activities influenced the course of medieval history remains one of the period's most intriguing unsolved mysteries. But the evidence suggests that your journey through medieval society's most gruesome occupations was actually preparation for something far more significant than simple employment. Something that medieval authorities worked very hard to erase from historical records. Something that might explain certain unexplained deaths, sudden political changes, and mysterious disappearances that shaped the course of European history. Something that connected the darkest aspects of medieval labor to the highest levels of political power in ways that would horrify modern historians if they knew what to look for in the surviving documents. But those secrets, dear listeners, belong to chronicles that have never been written and may never be told. Because some aspects of medieval employment were so dangerous, so morally compromising, and so politically explosive that they were buried along with their practitioners in unmarked graves that have kept their secrets for over 700 years. And perhaps that's for the best. After all, we've already discovered that medieval employment was quite horrifying enough without delving into the occupations that were considered too dangerous for official records. The 8 professions we've explored tonight were the ones that medieval society was willing to acknowledge, document, and discuss openly. But in the shadows beyond those official records, in the spaces between documented history, there were other occupations, other specialists, other forms of medieval employment that served needs so dark, so powerful, and so necessary that they could never be officially recognized. And somewhere in those shadows, your journey through medieval labor's most gruesome occupations would have prepared you for opportunities that history has chosen to forget. Opportunities that might have changed everything, if only we knew what they were. But that, as they say, is a story for another night. A story that may never be told, because some medieval employment opportunities were so extraordinary that they transcended the normal boundaries between labor and legend, between occupation and conspiracy, between work and the kind of historical secrets that are buried so deep that they become myths. Sweet dreams.